McQuistion, for over 28 years talking about things that matter with people who care. Production of McQuistion is made possible in part by individual viewers, supporters of the Foundation for Responsible Television, the University of Texas at Dallas, creating the future.
You know, in the last few years, Russia has reasserted itself on the world stage in the Ukraine, Syria, the Crimea, and in its relationship with China. Joining us again are two experts on Russia and our co-host, Jim Falk, CEO of the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth. Jim, why don't you introduce our guests?
Thank you very much. Robert Donaldson is Trustees Professor of Political Science, Emeritus at the University of Tulsa. That's the same university where he served as president from 1990 to 1996. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and an author of 6 books and numerous articles on the politics and foreign policy of the USSR and Russia. Your most recent book is The Foreign Policy of Russia, Changing Systems, Enduring Interest. Looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you.
David Oualaalou. He's a founder of Global Perspectives Consulting, headquartered here in Dallas, Texas, a military veteran. David is also the author of several books, including his most recent, Beneath the Veil, Fall of the House of Saudand. His forthcoming book, The Russian Roulette, Russia's Infiltration of American Society, will be available next year. Good to have you with us as well.
Pleasure to be with you.
So, David, for nearly 3 decades, Russia had really been basically removed from the Middle East. And with the advent of the Syrian civil war, Russia now has a major presence. How did that happen, and how damaging is it to U.S. interest?
Isn't that interesting about how geopolitics works? Whoever thought that the Russians will be deciding what's taking place right now in the Middle East? And of course, we have to go back, historically speaking, as to what led to that. Well, we can just go back to the invasion of Iraq that paved the way for Russia to start to think in terms of, okay, if the U.S. is going to be entangled in the Middle East, draining its resources, and that will pave the way for us to start to think in terms of how we can embark on an aggressive foreign policy, mainly in the Middle East. But the key factor to that, Jim, has to do with the Iran nuclear agreement. As you know, Russia was behind Iran to come to the table and agree to the terms with the P5+1. There was Russia behind it because Russia understood ahead of time that if they support Iran in this endeavor, they will reap the fruit of their labor later on. And that will be in terms of maybe entering into a strategic alliance with Iran, maybe establishing a permanent basis in Syria, which is what Russia did. Those are paved the way for Russia to embark on its policy in the Middle East.
What are Russia's critical foreign national security interests in the Middle East?
Well, in the Middle East, to ensure that the balance of power tilted back to what it was before. In other words, reestablishment of Russia, a sphere of influence in Syria, in Libya, ensure that Yemen does not fall into the hands of, for example, in support of Saudi Arabia, of the United States, and also ensure that Turkey now, that purchased the Russian weapons, Turkey that is a NATO ally, going with what Russia is suggesting. So
I'm glad you brought that up, because the United States basically has the monopoly on arms sales to the Middle East. Are you seeing a shift in that? And specifically, what about the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia?
Well, you don't see a shift for that from the United States with those two clients, Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates. They still purchasing.
That's solid.
That's solid. Where you see the shift now is between, for example, Iran, Turkey, and even Syria, of course. For Iran and Syria, they were clients of Russia. But now you're talking about advanced system being sold to those countries.
I'm sure we'll come back to the Middle East in a few minutes, but Bob, I want to ask you about an article that I saw this morning concerning Venezuela. It was produced by Stratfor, the Austin-based risk analysis company, and the title of it is Russia Throwing Its Lot In with Maduro in Venezuela?
Well, I don't think there's any doubt that Russia has thrown its lot in there. And this is another one of those cases where Mr. Putin is on the world stage trying to make Russia great again, if you will, and he sees obviously the Western Hemisphere, the Monroe Doctrine, kind of a sphere of interest of the United States. The United States denied Russia's effort to claim a sphere of influence in the former Soviet states, and so he's giving us back a little bit of that. Well, if you keep us out of our sphere and you interfere there, we're going to interfere in your sphere. But the other part of it, of course, is that Mr. Putin has made quite a fetish of opposing American efforts at regime change. I don't think he has any particular love for Maduro, and I don't think he has any particular thought that Maduro is necessarily governing Venezuela wisely or well. But I think he is absolutely opposed to the notion that foreign power should overturn regimes, having, of course, his own regime in mind in part.
And that was one of the roots of the problem with Hillary Clinton, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Hillary Clinton was seen as a proponent of that kind of infiltration and regime change. And when they had the demonstrations in Moscow in 2011, Putin said she gave the signal, and they revolted.
Well, it's interesting because, Jim, you obviously in the last couple of months have had the opportunity to interview former Ambassador Mike McFaul and also former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. I want to play a clip from one of your interviews with Madeleine Albright when you talked about foreign policy. So if you're ready for clip number 10, let's hear what Madeleine had to say.
The economy of Russia is certainly not doing well. An awful lot depends on oil prices and a variety of things. By the way, one of the things that I think is important to say, I don't think we won the Cold War. I think they lost it, and that's not just language, but a real thing. Because what happened was that communism doesn't work. It collapsed. The economic parts of it didn't work, and he has not put it back together in any shape or form. And so the economic situation, whenever I read about Russia, their growth rate is down. They really are not doing well. So what he is doing is working off of that man who's embarrassed and making Russia great again. And so I think that that is one of the things that he is kind of plugged into, that nationalist aspect, and then showing that Russia, by the way, has reintroduced itself into a position of power in the Middle East, and has pushed not just what they did in Georgia, but also in Ukraine, and some of the threatening things that they've been doing against the Baltic states. So I think that is what he's doing, and he is plugged into that nationalist theme in a way that keeps him in power, because the people are not doing that well.
Yeah, and I think that she talks about this foreign policy and making Russia great again. As you mentioned a minute ago, Bob, we have a president who's trying to make America great again as well. But the personalities play on this world stage, and most people are very critical of our president. We're typically fairly critical of President Putin. About 10 years ago, I interviewed a guy named Herb Meyer, who was in the Reagan administration and helped figure out with the national security apparatus that Russia was really economically extremely weak then, kind of like Ms. Albright said right there. So I want to take you to that clip with Herb Meyer when he's asked by one of our friends and audience members about what Putin's like. Is he a Stalin and all that sort of thing? So you'll hear Herb Meyer's, let's say, very strong opinion about Putin and what's happening in Russia. So if you're ready for clip 10, let's play it, please.
Is Putin Stalin with a human face?
Is he Stalin with a human face?
Yes.
Probably worse, yeah. Like everybody else, we hoped he was, a bit of a thug, but maybe a modern thug, and he's looking like a total creep. He is driving Russia into the same ditch the communists drove it into back in the 20th century.
Well, and not
Too
only
bad.
that,
Couldn't be a mess.
but the demographic issue in Russia is pretty dire too, isn't
The
it?
population of Russia is now dropping so fast. By the way, the average lifespan of a man in Russia is under 58 years. The population is dropping so fast that by 2050, the population of Russia will be smaller than the population of Yemen, which has one of the world's high birth rates. Yemen's a little place. Russia covers 1/6 of the Earth's land surface. So what did they do? The governor of the province of Ulyanovsk, Putin's man, has issued a proclamation. From now on, September 12th of every year is officially the day of conception. Don't laugh, you're being culturally insensitive. Under the terms of the proclamation on September 12th, all workers are given the afternoon off with orders, I'm quoting the proclamation, with orders to go home and create a patriot for Russia. This strikes me as not a brilliant idea.
Well, I'm not sure exactly what that has to do with foreign policy. It seems more like domestic policy to me in Russia, but it is instructive about what's happening there within the particular country. And Jim's going to shift in a minute to the Baltics, but one of the questions that you asked Ambassador McFaul had to do with what his concern was for the future. So let's hear what Ambassador McFaul had to say about what his concerns were, and then see if you guys agree with that at all. So let's run clip 20 if you're ready.
What gives you the greatest concern in 2019?
Tough question, because I can think of several. I still think we have not come to terms with how to deal with disinformation from external actors. And I say that as a government, as a society, and so that piece I think we need to keep working on, and the Russians haven't stopped what they're doing. But I guess if I had to think about that, my greatest concern, and I give it a low probability event, but it's a really horrible outcome if it happens. And here it is. It's not Russia rolling tanks into Tallinn, Estonia. I don't think that's very unlikely to happen. But what I do worry about, let me give you two, because I want to be, they're both Estonia and somewhere in the Balkans. So here's the scenario. They don't roll into Tallinn, but some Russian kids get in a fight with some Estonian kids in a city in Estonia on the border. Some ethnic Russians get killed. Narva, pick the city of Narva, it's right on the border. And then the Russian government decides to send in some special forces, and they kill some Estonians, and then they leave. What are we going to do then? Are we going to go to war with Russia over that? Article 5? That's a tricky, hard area. The other one I worry equally about is something happening with one of our new allies in the Balkans that I'm sure 95, maybe 99% of Americans don't even know they're a member of NATO. And there's a coup and it's all murky, not unlike what happened in Montenegro not too long ago. And the Russians are involved, and the country in question says the Russians have violated our sovereignty. What's going to happen then? Are the Italians going to rally to that? Or the Germans, the French, or the Americans? And that's where Putin will be testing us. He'll be testing our commitment to the NATO alliance, not with a conventional war in Tallinn, but in a very kind of murky set of circumstances in a faraway place in the Balkans that nobody even really knows is a part of NATO.
Which makes it so much more challenging. Bob, there's a lot to unpack there, and Americans are not known for their expertise in geography. Just help us first understand what areas he's talking about, and then I'd like to hear your perspectives on the NATO responsibility.
Well, the Baltic states are the three former Soviet states that became members of NATO in 2004. They were the first to break away from the Soviet Union: Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. They are obviously very closely associated in security terms with what happens in Russia. The Balkans, down in the southeastern part of Europe, Russia's great friend Serbia. Serbia, of course, has this secessionist area of Kosovo, which has been recognized as independent. And then there are the other former Yugoslav states. When Yugoslavia broke apart, it really did create a cauldron of conflict, national and ethnic and religious, in Europe, and the Russians obviously have their friends there, and the West has its friends. But the key here is the membership in NATO. The three Baltic states became members of NATO, and that's good news and it's bad news. The good news is Putin is not going to roll the tanks in, like Michael McFaul said. The bad news is the enlargement of NATO into the Baltic states and now into the Balkans with Montenegro and North Macedonia, the newest members of NATO. That in fact does create, in effect, a security dilemma for the Russians and greater security threat for those now NATO members than they would have had otherwise.
All right, let me ask you one thing. There may be one person watching this program who does not know what NATO means. Would you mind telling us what NATO is, please?
The North Atlantic Treaty Organization formed, in fact, it's the 70th anniversary of the formation in April of 2019. It was originally the United States, Canada, and 10 of the West European states. It has now expanded to 30. It was the U.S. primary Cold War alliance, and its only first peacetime military alliance. When the Cold War ended, the Russians expected that NATO would end as well, and they dissolved their Warsaw Pact, which was the other side of that confrontation. But NATO has persisted, it has enlarged, it has expanded its mission, and it has done so against the interests of Russia, and now we see again a kind of a division in Europe with NATO on the one side and Russia without formal allies on the other.
And I might add that our former state senator, Kay Bailey Hutchison, is ambassador to NATO.
She is, yeah.
Well, and I think sometimes people forget that for a certain period of time there was even talk about having Russia be a part of NATO.
That's right, and both Yeltsin and Putin at one point expressed an interest in that, but it was not reciprocated. And they've also proposed, Putin in particular, a larger kind of security arrangement for Europe that wouldn't involve getting rid of NATO, but would be a way of working Europe into Russia into what they call the European security architecture. And Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State when that was proposed and said, we have no interest in that.
Should we not be perhaps more understanding of how Russia views its neighbors than perhaps we are?
Absolutely, and I think, again, I made a reference to sphere of influence or sphere of interest, and it doesn't just go back to the Soviet days. And by the way, Putin has said that whoever has a heart in Russia is going to miss the Soviet Union, but whoever has a brain does not want it back. And I don't think he's trying to reconstitute the Soviet Union or reconstitute the Russian Empire, but Russia has interests, economic interests, and particularly security interests in that area. And I think the U.S. has been, and its European allies, have been rather cavalier about not taking into account Russia's particular security concerns. As they say, even paranoids have real enemies, and the Russians sometimes seem to be paranoid, but sometimes it seems that the U.S. and its allies are being rather oblivious to Russia's concerns.
Yeah, and you're talking about, obviously, Bob, about the security interest, but David, there's another interest too that drives everything else. It's called money at last I checked. So LNG, would you mind explaining to the viewer what LNG is and why that's an important geopolitical issue, particularly between Russia and Germany, but even the whole European part, and then of course the pipeline that's being built now. Explain that to us as well.
Well, LNG, stands for liquefied natural gas. The reason that commodity is very interesting to Russians because Russia is considered number 2 in the world when it comes down to natural gas production, Qatar being number 1 at about 29% production. And also the importance of LNG, it highlights the link between geopolitics and energy. That's why anytime you see any transformation in the energy market, there is a reaction to geopolitical landscape for that. And this is, why is that important as of now? Is because the discovery of the liquefied natural gas in Egypt, the coastline of Egypt, about 10 trillion cubic feet of liquid. That's not a small amount of liquefied natural gas. Where the concern comes with that is now that Egypt's closer to Europe and Russia is considered number 1 supplier of natural gas to Europe, is this going to shift the pipelines from Egypt into Europe? If it is the case, then Russia is going to have to start to prepare before that plan is in place. But there is also the concern that what the liquefied natural gas project is going to do to the Nord Stream pipeline from Northern Europe into Europe. There's this geopolitical game that is played right now as we speak between 6 countries: Egypt, Israel, Greece, Turkey, and also Lebanon. Why? Because all of them thinking in terms access, where the pipeline is gonna have to go. Now they are talking here, but they're not considering what Russia might do. Because Russia, it is my belief that Russia will not allow any other pipeline goes to Europe.
Before we run out of time, I do want to ask you about Russia's involvement in elections, and not necessarily the United States, because apparently there was not collusion between the White House and Russia, but clearly Russia had a motivation and a strategy. What might we expect to see in 2020, and how are you seeing what's happening with Brexit?
Well, I think the Russians have clearly been interfering, whether there was collusion with the Trump campaign or not. There's no doubt that the Russians did hack political communications on the Democratic side, and that Russians manipulated social media in order to try to accentuate some of the divisions and weaken some of the support for Hillary Clinton in the 2016 elections. They were not really precluded from doing that. I think the U.S. intelligence services are more alert, but I don't think we've really taken the sufficient steps to stop that. In Europe, the Russians have an interest, again, in sowing division. Now, they don't have to work too hard at that, because President Trump has certainly sowed some division in the former Western alliance with some of our traditional allies, including the British. But the Russians are very interested in seeing anti-liberal parties come to power in Europe, and to weaken the European Union, which they see as both a geopolitical competitor, but also an economic competitor.
Poland, Hungary, are those a couple of countries you would be concerned about?
Well, in the sense that, yes, they now have illiberal governments, but the Poles are very anti-Russian. The Hungarians have been playing footsie with the Russians.
Right.
Is Russia's foreign policy really being developed by Vladimir Putin? Who's advising him?
Well, Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, a very, very experienced man, a diplomatic corps in Russia that certainly has a lot of experience. The Russian military, and you mentioned earlier Venezuela, and I think there you have sometimes the case where maybe the military takes initiatives more bold than the diplomats might want to see. That's happened in our foreign policy as well. There are a number of players there, and obviously Vladimir Putin sits as the commander-in-chief and the chief molder of Russian foreign policy, but he has a number of interests to contend with, including economic interests, where his chief economic advisors are telling him, hey, cool it with the West. That's really where our best trade and investment possibilities come.
So how much money is Russia spending now on defense? Are we seeing an increase?
There was an increase until about 2017, and now the Russian budget is constrained, and Mr. Putin, having heard expressions of pain from sectors of the Russian population, unlike President Trump, who's redirecting more of America's budget to the defense sector, President Putin has stopped that growth in Russian defense, though he certainly invested a lot in it in the past dozen years or so.
Yeah, David, one of the things that I've found in traveling to Russia and the former Soviet Union at one time as well, is that they're some of the nicest people I've ever met. I mean, other places that we've talked about, some of the nicest people I've ever met. I mean, you've traveled there, we've all traveled. I mean, how do you get the people who are real, who don't want this kind of government, including some who don't like ours? I mean, how do you get some of these people-to-people things so that we're talking to people who have interests that are more personal and less geopolitical?
Well, it's very hard, Dennis. It's because, remember, Russia, the way it is established, that the decision process is centralized to the point that you, as you mentioned earlier, you get Mr. Putin as the chief architect. Yes, he's going to talk to his commander-in-chief. Yes, he's going to talk to Mr. Lavrov. He's going to talk to Kislyak and so forth. It's still his decision at the end, and he moves in terms of chess games. Russian people might not even have anything to do with those decisions, but they can't do anything about it because of how the policies that Vladimir Putin pursues are some sort of little bit oppressive.
Let me interpose a somewhat more hopeful aspect here, and that is that Russia is no longer totalitarian. To compare Putin to Stalin, I think, is a big mistake, because Putin doesn't have the measure of control and the opportunities of control. The Russian people freely hear on the internet opposing points of view. The Soviet people and the Russians under the Tsars did not have that. The Russian people today can travel abroad. The Soviets had to be conformists in order to be able to travel abroad. And so the Russian people really are not, they're not truly citizens in the best sense yet, but they're not the kinds of subjects that they were in the past.
But when we had Ambassador McFaul here a few months ago, one of the things that he stressed, and the title of his book is Cold War to Hot Peace, is we don't have the exchanges that we used to have.
And we should.
And you talk about the Van Cliburn competition. I mean, the role that he played at one time when in the embassy was phenomenal. And you're not seeing the student exchanges or cultural exchanges, corporate exchanges that you used to have. And that's a shame.
You've got the last 15 seconds, David.
Just quickly to comment on Bob's word. The Russians, as a matter of fact, the parliament has passed a law now that if you criticize the government, you will be imprisoned. So the idea that you suggesting that the Russians can be open, I will have to disagree with you, Bob, on that.
Well, we have our disagreement on that point too.
We'll have to do another show, won't we?
That'd be another. I hope you're right, but I fear that you're right. So that's kind of where we are. Well, thank you both for being here. Jim, thank you. Great job on co-hosting. You know, sometimes today we seem to be thinking only of China when we think of international trade, competition, and potential military threats. That would be too narrow an approach, as you've heard. We hope that you'll use the information from this program to follow Russian diplomacy and aggression in the Baltics, the Middle East, and in their relationship with China. You can see our prior program on Russia-U.S. relations at McQuistionTV.com. We hope you'll follow us on Twitter, and most importantly, keep asking us into your home to
talk about things that matter with people who care.
For more information, call 214-750-5157 or email Nikki N at NikkiMcQuistion.com. Visit our website at www.mcquistiontv.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at www.twitter.com/McQuistionTV or download McQuistion TV video podcast on iTunes.